Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. I'm Lex Frieden, your host, and today we have a special edition of Focus on Abilities from Washington, D.C. Through the resources of the Municipal Channel of Houston and ILRU, the Independent Living Research Utilization Program at TIRR, we're here and we have a special guest, Betty Jo Berland. Dr. Berland is responsible for planning in the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, and for years been responsible for many other significant roles of the research agency. Betty Jo, thanks for being our guest today.
Thank you, Lex.
I think it's important for people to know what you do and how you got to where you are, what you did before you do what you do.
Okay. Well, my training was as a political scientist. My subject area of interest was the politics of social change. So I think you can begin to see the connection. Before I came to NIDR, I had worked in the anti-poverty program in community action, both in organizing and also in research and evaluation. And I had done some evaluation for some of the agencies, RSA and NIHR, and they had asked me to join them in this basis, and it was a very new agency. And so we've done a lot of things over that time. I think that I really equate what's going on in disability over the period of time I've been here, which has been a phenomenal amount of change, with the social change experiences that I had in the anti-poverty movement. I see a lot of similarities, and that's why it's gratifying.
Now, you, from that background, understand the value in applied research, and that's essentially what NIDR does, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we also did a lot of participatory action research, as it was called at the time, with rent strikers and voting rights movements for minorities and things like that.
NIDR's role in the research milieu in the United States generally is fairly narrow because it addresses issues pertaining to people with disabilities, and I guess because it is an applied research organization. Do you want to comment on that further?
Well, I think it's interesting. It's narrow in that sense, but it's very broad if you look at it internally, because it's every type of disability, it's every age group, and it's every aspect of people's lives, whether it's health or daily living or employment. It deals with medical research, technology and engineering research, social science research. It deals with dissemination and training. So from that perspective, it's very broad, although it is, of course, a very specialized niche.
Now, with that role, addressing all those various areas, the whole gamut of life for people with disabilities and for every type of disability, one, I suppose, with limited resources must prioritize. And that's one of the roles that you play with the agency now. Can you describe that?
Okay. NIDR has recently published a proposed long-range plan for the next 5 years, and the final version will come out in May in the Federal Register and be widely distributed, be on the web, and so on. This was a very elaborate planning process. We had advisory group of 15 members, the majority of whom were persons with disabilities. We had 12 commissioned papers, and we had focus groups around each of those 12 papers, which were very representative of our different constituencies, of people with disabilities being first, but service providers, researchers, policymakers also being in that, within the queue there, so to speak. The long-range plan is really taking a philosophical position that I think is taking advantage of the convergence of the disability rights movement and some of the advances in science and technology, because together those two developments have made a lot of potential for improvements in the quality of life and lifestyle and self-determination for people with disabilities. And we talk in the plan about the new paradigm of disability, and I don't want to argue whether it's new or half new or slightly old, but it's a paradigm of disability that says that disability, unlike all these survey definitions, which says a person has a condition that limits or prevents them from doing something, we say that a person has a condition that requires an accommodation in order for them to fully participate in society. And so it's not just the condition, but it's something that society contributes to this as well. And this new paradigm of disability posits that disability occurs not in the individual, but in the interaction between the individual and the environment. And it's that interaction. I mean, we study the individual, we study the environment. The new direction is how do we study that interaction between the two.
With that as the background for the plan, what are the major components, subject areas?
Well, we talk about a 5-point research agenda, and the 5 areas are improving employment outcomes, our location here, function and health, by which we mean restoring whatever function, maximizing function, but also a new really emphasis now on helping people maintain health in the community and prevent secondary conditions, longer lifespans and so on. It's making this more important. Our 3rd section is on what we call technology for access and function. Now, technology for function is pretty much personal technology for mobility, for hearing, for communication, whatever, medical technologies. Technology for access is systems technology for changing what's in the environment. The simplest thing is the ramps, the door access, the bathroom access, technological access, computers, perhaps the biggest example of the switch from one area to the other that everyone's familiar with is closed captioning. When I first came to NIDA, people who needed to use closed captioning had to buy a device at department store and take it with them if they traveled.
Closed captioning, or the script that goes on a videotape or a film, and it runs for the benefit of those people who have difficulty hearing, and we call it closed captioning because it doesn't show up unless somebody has a specific device, a decoder.
Thank you. And people used to have to carry their decoder box, buy their own, have their own. We had discovered that for pennies per television set, every television set could have a decoder built in, and therefore gives a kind of a universal access. And I would like to point out that, like with so much technology for disabled people, there are a lot of beneficiaries from the captioning other than people.
Well, it's true. Anybody who's been in a bar lately can tell that, that the sound is down and the captioning is on.
I have enough hearing loss that I need to use it for English movies, for one thing, for explanation, but it's excellent for people who are not English speaking to learn as the words, learn the understanding, and it's also very good for people with some kinds of learning disabilities to see the captions while they're hearing the words. So it has a more universal use, as we know about ramps and curb cuts and everything else. Anyway, then the next substantive chapter in the long-range plan we call Living Independently in the Community, and that's independent living and community integration. And finally, we get to some associated areas. We'll want to do research in demographics, on outcome measures, and on disability studies. We have 2 other sections of the plan. One is on, well, 3 really. One is on dissemination and utilization. And that's been a major emphasis in the last few years, something you've been involved with for a long time. Capacity building is another chapter, and new measures for managing research. If I could just go back to the new paradigm a little bit, I think there are a lot of implications of this new paradigm that's holistic. Implications for research, implications for the definition of disability and how we measure it. So we're working very much on changes in how disability is assessed and measured. We don't know what success we'll have in the broad picture with the census and other big agencies, but we're definitely working on it. I think that the new paradigm dictates that people be able to do research on that interaction, but also that research be much more participatory and inclusive. If you're looking at this holistic research, I think you have to involve people with disabilities and every other actor much more in the research. And also we have to teach people to do research under these new conditions. Research in the community, not the laboratory, not the hospital, not the nursing home, but research where things are really going on now. And so that leads right into the capacity building that we have to do. NIDER's targets for capacity building are researchers, first and foremost in the law is that's specified, but also for consumers, parents, and service providers, as well as the public at large and policymakers. And we think that the capacity to do good research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, on the new paradigm and in these new community conditions is something that we need to develop a skilled cadre of researchers. We think that, of course, we have a big emphasis now on training individuals with disabilities and people from minority groups in advanced research activities. But in addition to that, a lot of people with disabilities won't choose to become researchers and won't choose to invest their lives in learning how to do research, but they have a big need to know what research can mean to them, what they should expect if they participate in research, either as an advisor or as a research subject, and how to interpret research findings and make applications in their own life. So we want to use our capacity building that way.
Now, in that regard, Betty Jo, what would you advise people with disabilities, independent living advocates, and others who are sometimes critical of the rehabilitation research program? They say it's not on target as far as their needs are concerned and so on. How would you advise them to make it better, to make it how they would like it for it to be?
Well, you know, first and foremost, as an old community organizer, I'd say continue to voice your concerns, make the concerns heard. I think that and then the next thing is get involved. And there are a lot of ways to get involved with NIDER's activities. We require that all of our centers show what they are doing working with people with disabilities, and also that they show what they are doing specifically to address problems of disabled minorities, so that there are opportunities there to get involved. I think there are opportunities through the organizations to become directly involved with NIDER. We publish all of our priorities for public comment. Well, that's a pretty, you know, cut and dried thing, although we know of an example in independent living where it made a big difference in NIDER's revising its priorities. And we do hold focus groups around all of the priorities, and before we announce big centers or new centers, we do some participatory planning around that.
I suppose from a community organizing perspective, another thing you could say is that rather than simply stand back and throw stones or be critical of the program, a more constructive approach would be to go to Congress and advocate for more funding for rehabilitation research and to specify where that funding ought to focus.
Well, I think that it would be a very good idea to give input about how research ought to focus, both to the administration and to the Congress. Funding is up to their wisdom, and
well, it's not. I guess it's not your role to be lobbying for more funding. But the fact is that NIDER is an $81 million agency, and it is the disability research program for the United States. And compared to other funded research programs, publicly funded research programs. I think one of my mentors called it the jewel in the crown of the nation's research program. Nonetheless, that jewel is a small speckle compared to the funding that's provided to other sister agencies of NIDR.
Yes, NIDR does have a very small budget. We think we get a lot of mileage out of it. But I will say, as the planner, that we have a lot of projects in the queue that would be very important and very helpful if we can get to them.
Betty Jo, in closing, what would you advise researchers who were interested in really benefiting people with disabilities, and particularly as it relates to promoting independent living? What areas, some you mentioned, should they concentrate on, and how, in fact, should they do their research to make sure that it's consumer-oriented, as you've described?
Boy, I think the first thing I would say is we say in the plan that independent living is a philosophy, a movement, and a service program. I think that when people need to understand, researchers ought to understand that philosophy part of it, and they ought to understand the importance of movement, of it being a movement in terms of making social change. That it's not, and then of course the helping it to improve as a service system. And the Centers for Independent Living have a large scope already, but I think that they probably would be key to a lot of further community integration activities, if we could look at that. And I think we need to understand that role. I think we also, so researchers really need to take a look at that role. As far as how they can be more participatory in their research, I think that in deciding to go into research in this area, there has to be a reason, a motivation. And it's not the best funded area in the world, and it shouldn't just be a convenience area. There should be a motivation to want to understand how change happens, and how people with disabilities can participate in that change, and understand the culture, that there is, I think, a disability culture, and there are some cultural values that people who haven't experienced that need to know before.
So researchers really should immerse themselves in the milieu.
I think so.
Betty Jo Berlin, thank you very much for being our guest here on Focus on Abilities. You talked about the kind of commitment that researchers should have toward the disability movement in order to work in that movement. Certainly you and your colleagues at NIDRR have demonstrated that commitment through the years, and the products that many of us in the public have, particularly people with disabilities today, to benefit from are a product of your commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lex.
I want to thank all of you for watching Focus on Abilities. Please join us next time. Thanks very much.